when I realized Americans were not that progressive, when I started working with them. And I worked with them 17 years. So I think that's enough time to kind of get an estimate on how progressive a population is. And it's not because I'm judging by this anecdotal evidence. It is because I can see the trends. I can see the patterns. And those were the patterns that I was able to recognize. And this what made me actually really reconsider my relationship with my own past and the past of the country that I live in and the past of the USSR. This is one of the reasons why I actually started reading more about the Soviet history as I was more in contact with Americans and as I could see that this illusion of a free world was crumbling right before my eyes. I realized I needed to check on the history of my own people, of my own ancestors, and I did. And it did help me gain a perspective on so many different things. And it did help me understand how the ideology forms, not only for my people, but for all people. And I'm not saying this to bash Americans necessarily. Many of my comrades are Americans. Some of my best friends were Americans. They're just no longer with me. But this critical reevaluation of the past really helped me in my personal journey. And it helps me now with some of the things I'm trying to do together with some other people. And that many different groups of people independently all over the world are trying to achieve, which is a better world for everyone, a liberated world. Thinking of all that made me reevaluate my own family history just because I used to kind of take it for granted, and now I do value it so much more because some of my family members actually were heroes, literal heroes who saved the world from fascism. One of my great-grandparents, for example, we actually believed he died in the battle under Stalingrad, which was a very famous battle. You can look it up yourself if you're interested in learning more details. But later we learned that he survived this battle and he actually died in Manchuria, which was one of the latest stages of the Second World War. I'm not sure it was technically a part of the Great Patriotic War as well, because these are two different timelines. If you're interested in learning more about the end of World War II, I highly recommend Sean's video on the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. These are very insightful, very well-researched videos. But going back to my great-grandfather, I think he was 27 or 28 when he died, and he had children already. So this is why I'm here today, because he already had children at the time. So he did die heroically, and he was buried in a common grave, as many of the soldiers were, just because they didn't necessarily have the time and the resources to have an individual burial for everyone. And we only learned about his grave like a few years ago, and we were able to recover some of the details. Just a note, I've never been to Manchuria, I don't know what it's like, but my great-grandfather did, and he found his last home there. Interestingly, my father's family, from which this great-grandfather came from, they were located in Russia, actually, even though they were ethnically Kazakh, and they lived in the Kazakh diaspora in the place called Astrakhan, which I think was conquered by Ivan Grozny, which is Ivan the Great. I don't know how you guys called him. I can look it up and put it here on the screen. So this territory has been long occupied. I think there was back and forth fighting for this territory, but my ancestors from my father's side came from that part of the world, and they did visit once, and they came from such a small place, such a small village, that if I were to name it, people would probably recognize the family because there are so few families living there and they're all relatives. I visited once when I was a child. It was a very interesting experience. It was a very desert-like location. It was kind of a mix between a steppe and a desert. They had camels there, which I didn't have encounters with before. So I was kind of scared being a child. And those camels were a little aggressive. They were just running around and spitting on everything and everyone. And I was afraid of the camels. And I did bond with a dog, with one of the dogs, and we ran through the dunes together, and it was kind of a fond memory of mine. We did visit some graves of our ancestors, and I still have a little bit of soil from those graves that I'm keeping. Even though I don't share a lot of those type of spiritual beliefs, I still keep it kind of as a token. Now, my mother's part of the family came from some places in Europe, Poland, Germany, most likely, but I know that some of my ancestors may have been from some of these areas, and they lived in Siberia in a little tiny village. And my grandfather, who was born there, he told me that it was very harsh and it was not a very friendly place to live in because of the weather, because of the wolves. He told me of the stories of being alone in the woods when he was young. and being scared of the wolves, obviously, because sometimes people would get unfriendly encounters with wolves and bears. Yet another part of my mother's family, I did share this story on TikTok actually. My great-grandfather was the enemy of the state, actually. His parents were proclaimed the enemies of the state. So he was 8 years old, as far as we know, and he was placed in foster care after his parents were taken away, most likely executed, and we don't really know what they were doing. We have some bits and pieces of information that they possibly were some diplomats having some ties with Middle East and the Arab world. This great-grandfather of mine, during his lifetime, was referred as a gypsy. This was the word that they used, even though he wasn't, most likely, but he was dark-skinned, had curly hair, and striking green eyes, so he did have quite an unusual appearance. He did join the army as well to fight in the Great Patriotic War. Part of the reason why he did that was to wash away the shame of the family from himself and prove that he was a communist, and he actually was a communist. He joined the party and he remained a communist for the rest of his life. He did tell my mother a lot about this and his experiences in the Soviet Union and during the war. He did come back from the war and he was injured pretty severely there. He was disabled for life. He had mobility issues, but he didn't lose spirit. He was a pillar in his community. He allegedly had multiple children with various women, and my grandmother didn't even know she was her actual father up until later when she grew older, because there were a lot of orphans and a lot of children kind of would stick with a certain family, or some families would take care of multiple children just because somebody didn't return from war, somebody was sick, somebody had a lot of other issues to deal with. So families really did look after each other. So this is how I have some relatives who are not blood relatives in Kyrgyzstan. This is from my grandmother's side. They maybe are somehow related, but most likely they're not. But we still consider each other family. And these are just some of the stories of my great-grandparents and grandparents. And just imagine, all of these people somehow met in all the different places in the USSR and got married and had children. And it's just so fascinating to me to learn about all of these different connections that all of these different families had, and to all come together in Kazakhstan. Just to recap, so some of my ancestors were born in Siberia, some of my ancestors were born in Astrakhan, some of my ancestors were born in Kyrgyzstan, some of my ancestors were born in Kazakhstan. And of course, on many of my ancestors, the records were not really kept because they were peasants. Nobody really cared about them. But came the Soviet Union, and all of a sudden they became important to the state, and they became important to everyone. And they were not only recognized as humans, but were given all of these opportunities of education, housing, and a meaningful job. So none of them were any high-ranking officials. Most of them came from villages, very rural areas that are mostly now very much poverty-stricken. And if it wasn't for the Soviet Union, they would not be able to do what they did. They would not be able to accomplish all of the things they did accomplish. So some of my grandparents were engineers, and they helped keep maintenance here in the city, which is now very poorly maintained, I must say. And my grandparents are dead, and they can't see that, which I'm almost glad about, because I'm happy they cannot see this devastation that's happening now. So growing up, I was surrounded by a lot of people with very similar family histories. We had a lot of mixed children, and we had all of this cultural exchange. We would have all kinds of influences, which I kind of shared briefly before. People developed their own dialects. They spoke with all kinds of different interesting accents. Many people spoke multiple languages, not just Russian and their own native language. They would often learn another language just for fun, and because it also gave opportunities for relocation, because people were able to travel all over Soviet Union. They were able to apply for jobs in a totally different country. Actually, this is how some of my grandparents came here to this place. They would apply for a university or for a job in a different location. Usually they would travel south from the north because of the climate, because it's milder and nicer for life. And then they would meet somebody and fall in love and start a relationship and find a new home in this place. Even in the 90s, in the darn 90s that I hate with a passion, we still had the remains of this great international that was started in the Soviet Union, which I'm very grateful for. It really helped me. It really shaped me. I would even argue that I'm kind of a third culture kid, because I was growing up with so many different cultures, and it was so hard for me to kind of untangle that when I started visiting other post-Soviet republics, which were now independent. I kind of had a little bit of culture shock just seeing find that there was actually a growing distance between what I knew and what I grew up with and what was happening in other places. Most of these changes were negative in the sense that there was more growing chauvinism, more xenophobia against all kinds of people. And that is a very capitalist occurrence. It usually happens when people are poor, when they don't have access to the basic necessities. And it's very convenient, right, to blame a certain group of people. This is everyone's favorite divide and conquer technique. So I was shocked to see in Russia and in some other places that there was a dislike for certain groups of people, depending on their skin color, their eye shape, or whatever. I was growing up naively thinking that we have reached the post-race society because I was living with a lot of that Soviet heritage, the books, the movies that promoted diversity and humanity above all else. And unfortunately, it is still getting worse. There is rising nationalism here. There is rising nationalism all over the world. I hate it with a passion, but I understand that it is the material conditions that lead to this. But going back to the beginning of the video, as I shared, I did work with Americans for 17 years. So I did continue having international experiences as I grew older. I would meet people from all over the world, not just Americans. It's just the majority of the people I worked with were Americans, but we had people from all over the world. So I was lucky in this regard to continue exploring and learning about different cultures. And I think that really greatly helped me widen my horizons and become a better person. I do still keep in touch with a lot of people from all over the world, and I'm very grateful for all of these experiences I have had. But ultimately, I'm most grateful for the fact that I was born in a place that at least attempted to build an equal society with humanity's needs in mind, that strived for justice for a long, long time. And I am very grateful to be the offspring of the people who built new types of societies, who fought against fascism and won. And I'm very proud of this. And I'm not proud of a nationality. I'm not proud of what kind of people they were. I'm proud of their actions, because actions make a person, not their genes, not their appearance, not all these little superficial things that people like to care about nowadays. What they did spoke louder than any words, and this is what I want to do as well. I want my actions to speak louder than my words, and we'll see what happens of this. Let me know of your family history if you feel comfortable. Consider supporting me on Patreon. Do take care of yourself and your community first. I hope you have a great day, and I'll talk to you sometime later.